I'm curious if reading this, you realize that there's a bit of a tension here between Mercier and your boy Popper. You know, Popper's got this whole thing where we're very easily led by the nose, as a quote that we talked about a couple episodes back. So yeah, I'm curious if this changed your mind on that at all, or how you're squaring these two clearly distinct theses.
I don't think of them as distinct. That's interesting. I hadn't actually.
Here we go.
Yeah. That's fine. Welcome back to another episode of Increments. I am one of your hosts, Mr. Vaden Masrani, a senior research scientist in machine learning, and my homie, Mr. Benny with the Stacks Chug. The Stacks being Substack, because he just moved on to Substack. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to give a plug to our listeners about that, but I figure that's worth talking about right at the beginning.
Sure, yeah. So I bowed to pressure after 5 years and moved my personal writing over to Substack. It's called The Steps of Phaeacia, which is a weird name, but you can read more about the origins over there. So yeah, if you want to subscribe, you can come hang out with me over there. I am hoping it encourages me to do a little bit more of casual writing. I had this constant issue writing and posting stuff on my website where every essay had to feel relatively polished, which I think kept me from publishing a lot of stuff, especially if it didn't have a nice, coherent, closed out thesis that was simultaneously closing itself off from all possible rebuttals and justifying itself, before anyone.
Are you making fun of me a little bit?
Yeah. But yeah, no, you do feel that pressure depending on the format, which is quite interesting, right? But just knowing that Substack's a little bit more casual, I'm kind of hoping just helps me get more things out the door more quickly, cleaning those pipes, as they say.
Just keep those pipes clean. I suffer from that so badly, and I can never really write until I'm super mad about something or super excited about something, and then if I'm not excited or mad, then it just keeps falling down the to-do list, and work gets higher. So I gotta write more, and I'm gonna be keeping a close eye on the success of your Substack as you're shooting off stratospherically. I will just be in your shadows and trying to motivate myself to do some more writing. But yeah, so it was Steps to Phaeacia. If people Google Benny Chug Substack.
Phaeacia, yeah.
Phaeacia, yeah.
Phoenicians are real people. Phaeacia is Greek mythology. Yeah.
I see. Sweet. Well, we are on Discord. One of us is on Substack. Come check out our YouTube channel. Send us money through Patreon. Blah, blah, blah. What are we talking about today, Mr. Benny Chug?
Also, no, I have another request, which is if you're so inclined to rate us on Apple Podcasts, that would be greatly appreciated. But I need the world to know that we've partitioned the world. I'm in control of our U.S. listenership. You are in control of the Canadian listenership. So whenever U.S. listenership is higher than Canadian listenership, I just count that as a win for myself. and I'll have you know that our U.S. ratings on Apple Podcasts, 5 stars, 100%. I'll also have you know that our Canadian ratings are not as good. Couple 3 stars, I think a 1 star in Canada. So you better start bribing people over there to pick up their ratings.
Are their names public? Can I figure out who this is? And
no, I don't think it's public.
Wait, where are you even getting these ratings? You have just surprised me, sir. Where are these numbers coming from? And what the hell, okay, Canada? So admittedly,
I haven't checked in a few months. But I think there are different rating systems depending on which country you're in. So there's an apple.com where you can look at increments and see our ratings, and then there's an apple.ca where you can look at them. And so listeners, if you'd like to help me maintain my streak of 5-star only ratings, then I would greatly appreciate that. And if you hate us and want to give us a 1-star rating, I kindly request that you do it with a Canadian, either on a Canadian IP address, or if you're not in Canada, then you use a VPN.
Fuck, man. The tariffs have changed you, Ben. Yeah, we used to be allies, and now we're competing.
Full nationalistic mode over here. Yeah,
that's so funny. Yeah, no, great call. Also, I guess you can get ratings on Spotify too, and comments as well on Spotify. So if you happen to be on those platforms, please rate us super high and comment us really nice, and everything will be good.
Or if at least if you're going to give us like a 1-star rating, at least write a funny comment or something smart about why we suck. You know, like we want at least our adversaries to be smart, well-informed, interesting adversaries. We don't want any of this adversary slop that's just rating 1 star without defending yourselves. You know?
Yeah, and if you're going to write us a 1-star rating, you can also just put it on a different podcast, and we'll read it from that podcast's.
We'll get the message.
Yeah, we'll get the message for sure, but just put it on, I don't know, Lex Friedman's podcast or something like that. And we'll read it there. Kick off this episode. Why are we here?
In a couple weeks, we're going to have Hugo Mercier on the podcast, largely to discuss his second book, Not Born Yesterday. We discussed his first book in episode 39, I believe, and we were both big fans of that. And so we just wanted to chat to him about his work at large and what he's been up to in the interim. We were supposed to actually have that conversation a week ago, but it got pushed back for various reasons. So today we thought we'd actually just dive into the thesis behind his second book ourselves, chat pretty casually about it, but just get some of the, lay the groundwork, as it were, for the information in that book, just so you guys are somewhat prepared for our conversation with him. And so that we can use our conversation with him to not necessarily just summarize the book, but to dive into some of the nuances, ask him probing questions and not just, ask him the standard, the standard questions about summarizing his book. So I think that's what we're going to do today. I don't think we're not going to view it as, because we're having him on, I don't think we're going to view it as a super comprehensive overview of everything that's in the book, because again, we can dive into the details later with him. So I don't think this is going to be akin to our first episode on the enigma of reason, but it will just be our overall impressions of it. And I think this will at least give you a sense of what's in the book and what his thesis is all about. Anything to add?
No, just that I love this book, and I'm really glad that we're doing Hugo Mercier after Height, because I definitely don't want to leave the impression that we're only ever critical of social psychologists. Hugo Mercier, I think you could call him a social psychologist, even though he doesn't necessarily use that terminology. He did reference at the end of his book his own field of psychology. And while he doesn't study things the way that most social psychologists do, he definitely has a lot to say about socializing. And the whole point of his first thesis, for his first book, is that he should view reason should be best viewed as a social phenomenon. So I don't know if he would necessarily call himself a social psychologist, but it's just nice to kind of place him in a similar space and see the quality of his work, because he is relying on theory, and in particular, the evolution of communication. And maybe so I think that you have got a better understanding of the book than I do. You spent more time prepping. But
what's new, listeners? What's new?
What's new? But let me say, like, the 2-sentence summary from my perspective, have you clean it up a little bit, and then maybe we'll just start riffing from there. But basically, he's pushing back on a single thesis, and it's the thesis that I think many people have in their head without realizing it, which is that you're a podcast listener, you keep up with the news, you consider yourself fairly highly informed, you read both sides, you're a skeptical, critical thinker, but everybody else on the planet, they're just a huddling mass of pliable idiots. They're just the gullible public that can be misled by demagogues like Trump, like all these idiotic Trump voters. Like, what the hell? Like, how could they be so gullible? Or brainwashed by propaganda, or social media can just pump negativity into them. And this is the thesis he's pushing back against. So the title of the book is Not Born Yesterday. And the whole case that he makes is that human beings aren't actually that gullible, counterintuitively. Yes, there are a bunch of bad ideas out there. Yes, people believe weird things. Yes, there's conspiracy theories. But it's way more complicated than just this top-down cult leader, demagogue, pumping beliefs into people which they just credulously accept. And to make that case, he relies on the evolution of communication. And then the book is kind of split into 2 halves. So the first half of the book, he lays out his thesis, which we'll go into. The second half of his book, he basically applies that to a number of topical examples, like Cambridge Analytica, like Nazi propaganda, Soviet propaganda, this idea of like brainwashing and subliminal messages, prophets, and all this. So I thought the book was excellent. It totally pushed my own intuitions around. And while I didn't say too much right now about how he makes that case, I think that the way he makes that case is, from my perspective, incredibly persuasive and important. So that's my quick overview. What are your thoughts on that summary and your thoughts on the book as a whole?
I thought the book was good. I mean, he's a good writer. He's a fun writer. He comes at things, even though there's a lot of the examples he uses are examples that are like fairly well known in this style of literature now, like Gazelles, stotting, things like that. Examples that probably a lot of listeners are familiar with that we'll get into. He does attack it with a slightly different angle than I've seen other people attack it before, and that's always refreshing. So anyway, I think a good place to start is to actually start with his first book, The Enigma of Reason. And again, we covered this in episode 39, so if you want the gory details there, it could be useful to go back.
I just maybe add that the first book was co-written by Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber. I just want to make sure we shout out the second author. Whereas the second book, Not Born Yesterday, is just Hugo Mercier. But sorry.
Solo. Yeah, nice. So yeah, the very high level thesis of The Enigma of Reason, the first book, is that human reason evolved not for solitary purposes, for solitary reflection, but for social purposes. And in particular, it has two main modes. The first mode is the justificatory mode. So I have some ideas in mind, and I want to convince you of those ideas. And so this is why we're so good at justifying ourselves. And this is how he explains things like confirmation bias, which he calls my side bias, and post hoc rationalization, etc. And so it's not necessarily truth seeking; it's about justification. And then the second mode is an evaluation mode. And so this is where we sort of critically assess the arguments given by other people. So when you're giving me information, I'm actually pretty good at spotting flaws and mistakes in that information. So you can't deceive me really easily. And so basically I view this second book as taking a closer look at this evaluation mode. Because if he's correct, then it should imply a couple things, right? So it should imply immediately that we're just not that gullible, because his whole claim is that we're good at evaluating the reasons other people are giving us, right? And so if we were just a bunch of credulous dupes running around, this would fly in the face of that thesis. And so, the first part of the book, he basically has to put forward an argument that we're not that credulous and that we actually are good at critically evaluating other people's reasons, and we don't just change our minds easily and fluidly given new information. And then once he's convinced you that humans are actually not that gullible, he has to then tell us, well, when do we actually change our minds? Because, clearly we do change our minds. We're not just in information silos, and whatever belief we held at time A always predicts your belief at time B. Clearly we update given new information sometimes. So when does that actually happen? What are the mechanisms of belief change?
Also, I think he has to explain, okay, if we're not gullible, well then why do people believe a bunch of really bad ideas as well? Because to say that we're not gullible isn't to make the claim that there aren't any flat earthers, there aren't any conspiracy theory nuts, there's not any vaccine anti-vaxxers, and there obviously are. So that too needs to be explained. Why are there still bad ideas that are widely circulated throughout the population that have basically been entirely refuted, but yet people still believe them? And so that part of the also needs to be explained too, which he does explain.
Yeah. So his claim is not that we are these perfect reasoners that only update when given new, true information, and that we're all just converging on truth all the time. But his claim is that we have these cognitive mechanisms that allow us to be vigilant around new information and not be easily duped by people trying to mislead us. But this does have a consequence, namely that sometimes we actually are closed-minded given new valuable information. These cognitive mechanisms that he appeals to did evolve in an environment that's significantly different from our own current information ecosystem. And so when we have people believing in bad ideas that are harmful to them or harmful to society at large and not true, he has to explain, like, okay, from the perspective of these cognitive mechanisms, why does it make sense that they believe in this? And so yeah, again, it's not to say that there's no bad ideas out there, but it is to say we're not as gullible as is often thought.
Yeah, I guess one thing I want to add is I really like your connection between this book and the first book in terms of seeing his view about gullibility as a direct consequence out of the thesis he makes in the first book, that reason has these two modes. However, when you read Not Born Yesterday, you don't actually really need to read the first book because it's very self-contained. And so, yes, there's this connection there, but in the Not Born Yesterday, he kind of starts from a different place, which I thought was interesting, and I'd just like your thoughts on this. Just the evolution of communication. I don't know if this is his theory or if this is like a widely understood theory outside of his work, but do you know much about that?
I'm actually not sure if this is entirely his thesis. I mean, people have obviously been thinking about why communication evolved, and there's been some mysteries around that. And I have no doubt that he's sort of putting a unique spin on it, or at least highlighting various angles of the evolution of communication that maybe other people haven't emphasized as much. But it's funny, I had the exact same question. I'm unclear if he's sort of leveraging a lot of the work that, like, a lot of the information we know about the evolution of communication, and then using that to support his thesis and provide these new theories, or if this like is extremely novel, and I just don't know the answer to that.
Something to ask Hugo in a couple weeks.
Yeah. Because I know people, there are different people with different theories of communication. Like Dawkins has actually worked a lot on this, and unfortunately, I just don't know what his thoughts are, or how different, if at all, this is from Mercier's stuff.
So let's think about the evolution of communication a little bit with regards to gullibility. So you have two people, Alice and Bob, and Alice is the sender of information and Bob is the receiver of information. And the question is, like, would a world where Bob is very gullible be evolutionarily stable? And I think the answer is obviously no, right? Because if Bob just believed anything that Alice said to Bob, then Alice could give Bob duplicitous information and manipulate Bob such that Bob is acting in ways that are not conducive to Bob's well-being, but to Alice's well-being. And thus, Bob would be bred out of the gene pool. Bye-bye, Bobby. And so it just it's not evolutionarily stable because then after Bob goes away, then Alice would have no one to communicate to. And then Alice's very communicative faculties would then also disappear. So if you could just manipulate everybody, then the people who are being manipulated would be bred out of the gene pool. And then the very act of communicating would be bred out of the gene pool because you wouldn't have anyone to communicate to. And so it can't really be that Alice can just say anything to Bob and Bob will just believe it, because that's just not a stable system. So that, I think, is one of his first major swings against gullibility, is that for communication to be reliable, even if Alice and Bob are in an antagonistic relationship, and this is where we get to the Gazelle stotting stuff, even if Alice and Bob fucking hate each other, there's still reasons to send reliable signals across these antagonistic barriers. Yeah, so actually, did I miss anything with that summary? I feel like there's more nuance to it, but talk a little bit about maybe where the evolution of where the stotting examples come in, and how that kind of relates to this idea that even when you are enemies, you still are incentivized to communicate true information.
Yeah, good. So I think, it's just worth lingering on this. So obviously, in this world, so the key insight is that if Alice was just constantly lying to Bob for her own gain, it would be advantageous for Bob to just basically shut off listening to Alice. He would get to a place of extreme conservatism, is what Mercier calls it, where he just didn't listen to any of the information he was being presented with. And so the key insight is that this actually incentivizes Alice now to not constantly lie to Bob. So now Alice evolves a strategy where a lot of the stuff she's telling Bob is true, is useful to Bob, Otherwise, he will never listen to her, right? And so from Bob's perspective, he develops and when we say he and she, obviously this is over like incredibly long time spans in these social settings, right? These aren't just individuals at this point. These are lineages of individuals. But from Bob's perspective, what he'll develop are what Mercier calls these open vigilant mechanisms. So to take that in reverse order, vigilant refers to the fact that he has to be scrupulous about what Alice is telling him, because again, he can't just be totally gullible. So he needs to be vigilant. On the other hand, because there's now this pressure for Alice to provide him with some useful information, he needs to be open enough to stuff that she's saying to sometimes change his mind, to sometimes take that on board, right? And so he's open to new information and changing his beliefs in some circumstances, and very vigilant otherwise. And a cool corollary of this sort of dynamic is that most communication in most circumstances will actually involve more truth than falsity. Otherwise, you would descend into this world where it's just more and more advantageous to shut out most new information, and you would very, very rarely listen to anything new. And so there's always sort of this and this isn't to say people aren't going to try and mislead other people to get them to do what they want. Obviously that happens. But there does have to be this sort of core of honesty, or at least information that is useful to the other person to maintain communication, to maintain these open communication channels. And so the fact that humans communicate so much is proof of the fact that this had to be advantageous to both of us in some way. And so I thought this corollary was quite cool, that there has to be truth and utility sort of built into the information we're sharing by virtue of the fact that we're sharing information. And I think this is true if you just step back and even reflect in your own life. Most people that you meet and have a conversation with, even if they're trying to put a spin on things, it's very rare that every word out of their mouth is a lie designed to manipulate you, right? Often it's even 80 to 90% true, and they're just highlighting certain things that might get you to act on the margin in certain ways that would be advantageous to them, right?
Just gonna say, and also 80% may be true, and that doesn't mean that the 20% are lies. It could still be false, but it could be false but mistaken, right? We will absolutely be talking about the Trump phenomenon, because that's the screaming counterexample in my head. But keep in mind that that's not a counterexample to Mercier's thesis, because he's talking about over hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary pressures. There will be outliers, and we will be talking about Trump both, I think, a little bit in this conversation, but also with Mercier in a couple weeks. But the existence of Trump, the existence of a liar, doesn't negate his thesis, because he's talking about, on average, if there were unreliable signals, that would be blasted out. And so just to continue with, just to add that detail, because I know that example is going to be in some of our listeners' mind as they're hearing what you're saying. But yes, it does square, I think, really nicely with most conversations you have most of the time, because most people are just trying to tell you the truth, and they may be mistaken occasionally, but it's very rare to have actual lies.
So maybe let's turn to just some communication in animals that this theory can actually explain. Or at least where we can sort of see this theory in practice. So his first example is bowerbirds. And probably a lot of people in the audience have heard that bowerbirds are these birds that build these very elaborate nests for mating purposes. They make these nests, they decorate them with a bunch of berries, and they don't actually live in these nests. And these nests don't really serve any functional purposes. They're not protecting them from weather. They don't lay their eggs there and then keep their hatchlings there. They're just sort of used for during mating season to basically attract, the male bowerbirds are building these nests to attract female bowerbirds. So the usual story here is that this is an instance of sexual selection. So the male bowerbirds are building these nests to signal their fitness to the female bowerbirds, to tell them that they're going to be good mates. Now, back to Mercier's thesis, right? He's arguing that communication sort of needs to, at its core, be reliable. It needs to be beneficial to both parties for communication to work. And so in the bowerbirds case, for this signal to actually be reliable, female bowerbirds need to know that like a more elaborate nest with more berries on it is actually like a signal of reproductive fitness somehow, or at least social standing for the other bowerbirds. And at first this actually posed a bit of an issue, because you could imagine like even a weak bowerbird, why wouldn't the male just like put tons of berries on their nest to just make themselves seem like a more attractive mate? And indeed, this was a bit of a mystery until some ornithologist, I guess, accidentally stumbled on the answer by trying to build artificial nests, I believe, is what they were trying to do. And what they found was that if a male bowerbird puts more berries in his nest than is sort of socially acceptable, given his actual social standing in the community, the other male birds will go and like knock some of the berries off. And so the other males are like working to make sure the signal is reliable for the females. And so that means when the females show up and look at the nests, they can sort of be sure that the amount of berries on the nest is an actual reliable signal of the status of each of these birds in the community.
So why wouldn't the male birds, if each bird has 10 berries worth of resources, and those 10 berries are like a actual adequate reflection of the caregiving capabilities to the female bowerbirds, why wouldn't I go and knock all the other berries off so that they go down, like, so I still have 10, but all my competing bowerbirds only have like 2 berries? Like you're saying if you go above the average, then it gets knocked down, but I'm saying why not
just keep knocking it down?
Yeah.
I think this is where like he would appeal to it being an evolutionary stable strategy for it to be an honest signal. So I think he would say if you did that, then people would do that to you as well, and it would descend into a war of all against all, and there would be no signal left to begin with.
It's exactly the same with like the gullibility thing. It's just like the signaling would no longer be valuable, and it would just kill the whole species. Because I see, that's interesting. Gotcha.
Yeah, and so I mean, I agree. Like sexual selection stuff gets a little tricky to think about, and actually, this is a slight tangent, but I know Matt Ridley has a new book where he's sort of arguing against sexual selection. And he says this actually isn't a good explanation for a lot of phenomenon. And he actually appeals to this more holistic concept of just like things are being selected for because they're beautiful. I say all this with some caveats because I've only heard one interview with him on Econ Talk, which is a fascinating interview. But I think, maybe it's just worth pointing out for reference sake, and maybe for us to dive into later, is that there are competing explanations aside from sexual selection and signaling theory to say that why some of these sort of bizarre traits have evolved in the first place. The peacock's tail being the classic example of something that's useless but very pretty. And then usually that is also explained by appealing to signaling, right? Where it's like, okay, only if a really fit bird can have such a beautiful tail that's going to attract mates, and so then females can be sure that this is a big, strong male that can fend off mates, etc. But Ridley actually raised a good point, which is that why would you dedicate these sort of resources to something that is totally useless evolutionarily in the first place? Like, why not signal, like if you're going to signal strength and stuff with a fancy tail or a fancy nest, why wouldn't a species dedicate those sort of resources to something that's actually valuable? Like bigger muscles or something that can be seen by females but isn't actually useless or clearly disadvantageous when it comes to surviving in the wild. And I thought that was actually a pretty good point.
Let me just think, that is an interesting point, but my first reaction is that like evolution doesn't have a teleology, doesn't have a direction, and can't choose in advance what's the most useful thing to it's just whatever differentially produces reproduction of the genes in the gene pool. And so if that thing happens to just be that this bird got a lot more berries than this other bird, and then that bird's genes started to reproduce, then that would just kind of get locked in. But it's not as if there's some designer who's like, okay, of all the things you could signal, choose the one that's going to both signal and also make the best house. It's like not really a choice in that sense. It's just whatever happens to produce more copies of itself in the gene pool.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Does that get us anywhere?
Yeah. So you're arguing that there's sort of like these like local equilibrium effects where like it just so happened you stumbled into this situation where females for, some reason were selecting bowerbirds with more berries or peacocks with fancier tails. And then those dynamics took on a life of their own. And then you evolved towards some sort of equilibrium there. That's possible. I mean, I think it's true that there's no teleology in some godlike view sense. There is a teleology in the sense of like increased fitness in your niche, right? In terms of like, we can make predictions that like stronger, faster lions are going to outcompete slower, weaker lions. That's sort of a teleological claim. Then you get into issues where if you're just defining fitness in terms of reproduction, like that's sort of circular. But so anyway, I see what you're saying. Like you could get yourselves into these just like odd local equilibrium that then create their own sort of race dynamics. On the other hand, insofar as we just have this absolutely ruthless survival of the fittest, you would expect that if females are choosing male bowerbirds based on berries, well, okay, presumably there's some females that are slightly less impressed with that and slightly more impressed with bowerbirds with slightly bigger, I don't know what makes bowerbird survivability more likely, claws or something. Right?
Yeah, beaks.
Why wouldn't that happen? And this is obviously where my knowledge of evolutionary biology runs up against a wall, and I'm not sure, but it's an interesting thing to think about, and we should maybe read Ridley's book.
Yeah, I definitely want to check out Ridley's book. He's one of my favorite authors, without doubt. Okay, let's zoom out for a sec. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about how the example of bowerbirds shows us that the most evolutionarily stable state of communication, even between competitors and antagonists, is one of reliable, honest signals. So
on average,
on average, so if one bowerbird tries to cheat and bring in more berries, then that would threaten the reliability of the entire signaling communication, like the entire signal for all the birds, and then there's an incentive for the other birds to knock the other bird back down into to honesty land. Another example he gives is with gazelles stotting. What's a stot? A stot is when a gazelle jumps in place very, very high, and this is typically done to signal to predator animals that the gazelle is incredibly healthy. And it seems like a bit of a paradox, because if there's a bunch of gazelles on the savannah, and one gazelle sees a hyena coming, to stot is to basically draw attention to oneself amongst the group. That seems like it's a strange thing to do. But Mercier's point is that the height of a gazelle's stot indicates the fitness of the gazelle and the difficulty that the hyena would have, the amount of resources that the hyena would have to expend in order to hunt successfully that gazelle. And so even though there is an antagonistic relationship between the hyena and the gazelle, the communicative signal of the health of the gazelle is still reliably sent to the hyena, because it keeps the gazelle safe, and it also prevents the hyena from wasting additional resources to try to chase a very fit animal. Did I summarize that correctly? And
perfect.
And so the main thing that is unifying all these examples is that honest communication is evolutionarily stable across different species. It's not just human beings. Different species have this as well. Maybe another simple example is just like a poison tree frog. The colors of the tree frog indicate that the frog is poisonous. And lo and behold, the frog actually is poisonous. It's an honest signal. Yes, you can think of different examples where the frog is not actually poisonous or whatever, but I would say that those are small little niches that are produced because the majority of the signals are honest. And you can only be duplicitous, you can only have the butterfly wings that look like the owl's face in an atmosphere, in an ecology that largely is sending reliable signals. So to zoom out a bit, so now Gullibility is not evolutionarily stable. It pays to send reliable signals. However, unreliable signals still exist because in a world where everyone expects a reliable signal, there's an advantage to being dishonest. And one metaphor that he rejects, which I think is interesting, is the metaphor of the arms race. So Alice and Bob, Alice is incentivized to lie to Bob, but then Bob is incentivized to be skeptical of Alice. So then Bob's skepticism abilities go up, and then Alice's lying abilities go up, and then Bob's skepticism abilities go up, and Alice's lying abilities go up. And he rejects that. That would be like the arms race model. And instead, he uses the metaphor of an omnivorous diet, which I think is really interesting. So an omnivore evolves to eat all sorts of different foods, some of which have different kinds of pathogens. And so the omnivore's immune system has to learn how to digest food from many different sources and get rid of the stuff that could be harmful. The human immune system, or the immune system of an omnivore, develops a whole suite of different tools that can be used to make safe food from a multitude of different sources. So too with what he calls the open vigilance mechanisms, which you had alluded to earlier. Humans have evolved to consume information from a number of different sources, and those sources can be reliable to various degrees. And so just like with the human immune system, the human's open vigilance system are a suite of different techniques, filters, heuristics, sanity checks, all of which are imperfect, but all of which serve the function of cleaning up the information that is coming to you so that you can not be harmed by it. You cannot be easily misled, easily pulled around by the nose. And that's how we move from the evolution of communication and the animal examples to the bulk of his book, which is exploring these different open vigilance mechanisms.
I'm curious if reading this, you realize that there's a bit of a tension here between Mercier and your boy Popper. You know, Popper's got this whole thing where we're very easily led by the nose, as a quote that we talked about a couple episodes back. So yeah, I'm curious if this changed your mind on that at all, or how you're squaring these two clearly distinct theses.
I don't think of them as distinct. That's interesting. I hadn't actually.
Here we go.
Yeah. Let's fucking fight. Yeah. Popper's thesis is not that we are all easily led by the nose. It's that if you had to choose between two theses that were smart, but wicked, or dumb, but moral, then he would prefer the second of the two theses, right? That was the context in which he said that.
I think he literally says we're easily led by the nose.
Yes, but in the service of the because this is where he's talking about, I believe, Bertrand Russell, right? And Bertrand Russell thinks that we're smart, we're too smart, but we're also wicked, and our wickedness is the thing that had led to the atom bombs and the gas chambers. But Popper says, no, it's not that we're smart but immoral. It's that we're dumb and are too moral. And the easily led by the nose thing, we'll have to talk a little bit about that. It's not so much profits pulling people, but it's more about popular sentiment and stuff. And so if by led by the nose you are referring to a single person, like Hitler or something, I would agree that Popper is wrong. If by led by the nose you expand that to like cultural theories like Marxism or fascism or anti-Semitism or conspiracy thinking in general, which doesn't come from an individual but comes kind of bottom up, and you're led by the nose by just being misinformed by bad theories, then one, I think that agrees with Mercier's thesis, and two, I think that's closer to how Popper views things because he views ideas as being the most important, not individual demagogues.
Okay, well, we'll just let listeners go back and listen to the quotes we mentioned in that episode.
But let's not actually forget that the way that I discovered Mercier was through Brian Boyd, who read some of Mercier's early work, saw echoes of Popper, and then signal boosted Mercier. So the connection to Popper is via Boyd. So fucking take that, buddy. Take that. Yeah. So
Vaden will freak out if his favorite thinkers are not entirely internally consistent with one another. We're seeing the rationalization kick into high gear here. Like, no, they all must agree.
let me just give you what you want, which is that, Popper was wrong, and that Mercier has built upon it to make more sophisticated Popper's mistaken theory of demagoguery, which I don't think is accurately summarizing Popper, but that's basically what you want me to say, and that's fine enough because Mercier is building on Popper's work and taking it in different directions and stuff. So it's all roughly simpatico from my perspective. But
I'm going to cut out the little clip of you saying Popper was wrong and just play that over and over again. I'm going to go to sleep to you saying that.
Dude, but now my SIGs are unreliable. If you do that, I don't want my SIGGIes to be unreliable.
Yeah, your poor SIGs, bro. We'll stop talking altogether. Oh boy.
Okay, where are we? Get us to whatever you want.
Let's maybe talk about some of the open parts of our open vigilance mechanisms, because we've covered that we're not super credulous, and so that sort of covers the vigilance. But then this question remains, like, when are we open? When will we actually subscribe to new information? And this is where Mercier's thesis gets quite intriguing for me, because it's a mix of optimism and pessimism from my view in terms of our ability to track truth and be rational, etc. And so, yeah, I'm curious if my reading of it tracks with your reading of it. And I'm curious about just like your general sentiment of it, whether you think this is sort of good news overall or not. Yeah, maybe just summarize at a high level first. I mean, he gives multiple conditions under which we will take aboard new information and actually change our beliefs. So let me just list a few. So the message, the new information you're receiving must be plausible given what you sort of believe already, right? It probably can't be an absolutely radical shift that will destroy your entire existing worldview. It helps if it's like reinforced socially. So, for instance, that it won't have you become socially ostracized if you adopt that view, or that adopting that view could actually like win you some social status. The source must often be trusted. So you would naturally have to be able to actually trust the information that you're reading or hearing. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes that's the individual, sometimes that's the mechanism by which the information is being delivered to you. So someone might cite like peer review or something as an example, where it's less so the authors, but more the institution behind delivering you the information. And then finally, the arguments must actually sort of be good. They have the arguments must seem truth tracking. They must seem reasonable. They must bear enough resemblance to the truth to actually warrant you to change your mind. And so the reason I say this is sort of a mix of optimism and pessimism is, first, it's optimistic in the sense that good arguments can indeed change your mind. And this actually brings us maybe closer to what we talked about in the Enigma of Reason episode, right? Which is that, if you put people in groups and ask them to discuss things and try and converge on the truth, we actually are pretty good at that because we engage our critical faculties and everyone's sort of critically debating new information that's being presented and sort of tearing each other's arguments down. And by this, you can sort of, this process of criticism can allow people to sort of converge on what's actually true. So that's good. But then there's also this fact that a lot of the reason we change our mind is because of conformity, is because like we trust someone, or it's socially advantageous for us, or, it aligns with various other pre-existing beliefs or something. So there's sort of this conformity bias built in to us changing our mind. And then you can see why you get into situations where, based on what your social group is thinking, based on the information ecosystem that you exist within, like why believing certain things would be good for you, and why people take aboard some beliefs that seem obviously false from an outsider's perspective, but seem socially advantageous for you as an individual to take on. So yeah, I'm curious what you make of all that.
I'm kind of going to maybe respond starting at the top of what you said and just add some extra details. So open vigilance is a term that he introduced in this book, and in previous work, he called it epistemic vigilance. But the reason he changed the phrase epistemic vigilance to open vigilance is that epistemic vigilance kind of makes it seem like it's this like walled fortress that is just trying to prevent information from coming in. But his point is that no, it's not this necessarily this walled fortress. Like people want to change their mind. No one wants to be in the dark.
They want to learn. Yeah.
They want to learn, absolutely. And the social component, is a component of it, of course, but it's not as if there's a hierarchy here where social comes most important and then good arguments come second important. No, it's like all of these things are in play all simultaneously,
totally.
like with the immune system. And so maybe one dimension where Mercier differs from one of Cam's favorite authors, Mr. Robin Hansen, and like everything is signaling and everything is about social acceptance and stuff, is that Mercier just says that's one of many things. It's not the most important. It is important, but it's one of multiple different epistemic mechanisms. Like, let's just make it contemporary, because one of the things I like a lot about this thesis is how relevant it is. So, like the Trump stuff. Let's talk a little bit about Trump stuff. With the whole like tariffs against the entire fucking world, even people like Ben Shapiro now are making videos about how this is insane, right? So let's just apply like the Ben Shapiro tariff thing to what you just said about like social acceptance and conformity. If there is enough stuff coming at you that just cannot square with your pre-existing, say, comments about tariffs, and you can't make an argument that justifies it, then you may change your mind despite the social pressure to conform, right? So the social cost is going to be that some of his hardcore like MAGA fans are going to be annoyed that he's now criticizing Trump. And he's not criticizing Trump as strongly as I would like him to, but he is at least making videos in the right direction that this is not beneficial. So I guess my response to you would be that using social conformity as a mechanism is good in most cases. Like, why do we believe in quantum mechanics? It's not because you and I have studied the frickin' thing. It's because we're conforming to what smart people who we trust say, right? But it's fallible. Plausibility checking against pre-existing beliefs, reasonable thing to do most of the time, but that's fallible as well. And so considering all of these not as, let's say, to use a bit of Deutschian language, foundational justifications for belief or rejection, but just heuristics, sanity checks, things that we tend to do automatically without really thinking about it. So I guess I don't necessarily see this as a positive or a negative. I see it as just a statement about what is, and then we can use that information to hopefully understand our minds a bit better and then understand things like the Trump phenomenon. But that's just maybe a scattershot response to a lot of the points you made, but maybe attack me if anything seems weaker.
Yeah, what do I think? I mean, okay, yeah, first is to just highlight the point you made that these are very natural and in most cases useful, especially, back in hunter-gatherer days, ways to adopt new information. So like, yeah, you often do just want to listen to people you trust, right? And of course things should be plausible given your priors, and having it be reinforced socially is useful because you're often looking to mimic people with the most social status, because those people often know how to do things the best, or like there's a reason they have the most social status, and so you want to figure out like what they're doing and copy it. And so of course, yeah, so these mechanisms are definitely super useful. My I guess my view is that I think this aligns better. I think Mercier's account aligns better with the story that's being told by like the rationalists and like, yeah, the Robin Hansen types, the Brian Kaplan types, about like reason. It is largely playing this role of like social verification and like in-group and like appealing to your in-group, and is not necessarily reasoning about everything from first principles. And I guess I could never quite tell. I've always been quite persuaded by that view, and I think it just explains the world around us much more parsimoniously.
Sorry, the Hansonian view or the Mercier view?
Well, I think Mercier is much closer to the camp of like the Hansonian less wrong kind of bias, like we're biased in our thinking view, like we're systematically biased in some ways in our thinking, than it is to like the Deutschian Popperian view. That, I mean, Popper doesn't talk about these mechanisms as much, but I think someone like Deutsch would want to say that like we're quite rational as individuals, and we can just be trusted to like truth seek, and it's just all about like good explanations at the end of the day. And I think what this misses is that like what you consider a good explanation is often informed by your social milieu and the people around you and what's going to gain you status in certain circles. And I think Mercier sort of puts and it explains this in a very satisfying way that to my mind sort of vindicates the view of humans as, you know, we can be biased and like we are sort of biased in systematic ways. And that's very natural and should be sort of expected, given that we're social creatures. And it just explains people's beliefs much more easily than I think Deutsch can, by just saying like everyone's just adopted. Like it's just I think the Deutschians sort of just focus on individuals pursuing whatever they think is the best explanation. I just think that doesn't have much explanatory power in terms of like looking around the world and trying to explain like why certain people believe certain things. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a lot there. So I would want to claim that a major difference between, let's first do Mercier and Hansen, and then we'll do Hansen and Deutsch. But I think a major difference between Mercier and Hansen is just the emphasis of how much the social stuff comes into play. Because correct me here, but I think Hansen would want to say that like pretty much all of your motivations are entirely due to seeking status and signaling status. And if you get a PhD, it's not because you're just like genuinely curious about how like machine learning works. It's because you just want to signal to your peers that you're like smarter than them and that you have gone to a prestigious school.
Yeah, I'm a bit uncomfortable actually attributing this to Hansen. I'm actually not sure what he thinks about this, but we could just use him as a stand-in for this view, I guess. But I just want the audience to know I'm not actually signing off on this view of Hansen's. I know you might be able to make the argument with respect to like Brian Kaplan with his
yeah, no, that's fair.
Rationally irrational stuff, but again, like I don't think any of them are this caricatured view of like absolutely everything is signaling.
Okay, so that's just me misunderstanding the thesis. So like, what is the thesis of elephant in the brain then? Isn't it all just like everything is signaling?
He argues that like more things are signaling than we think. Like there's a significant part of healthcare that is signaling. I don't think he would ever go so far as to say like everything is signaling.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I just fully retract that then. Yeah, I retract that.
And so that's kind of why I'm saying I think Mercier just aligns with these people somewhat better than he would align with someone like Deutsch if you had to plot him on this spectrum.
Sure. So okay, let me retract what I said. I guess I was strawmanning Hansen's view. So if both Hansen and Mercier are saying that signaling is just one of many different things, maybe you'll accept this, that Hansen just focuses on the signaling stuff more. Like that's like the main thesis of Elephant in the Brain. Let's add a veil of nuance around it as well. Whereas Mercier just puts that as one of like 7 or 8 bullets that are all part of this open vigilance mechanism. Social status, social signaling being just one of 8 or 9 different things that we do. Would you accept that? First of all, because I don't.
Let's just focus on Mercier more because I'm just like, I'm a bit uncomfortable talking about Hansen and Kaplan and those characters right now because I'm not familiar enough about exactly what they would say in this situation. But like for me, Mercier is basically making 4 points, 3 of which are about the social part of belief, and 1 of which is about arguments are good. So like I view basically like the fact that the source must be trusted, that's a social thing. Like who do you trust in the first place is dictated by social
hold on. So Mercier's entire thesis of the first book is that reason is a social phenomenon. So yes, social is an aspect, but let's just separate social from like social status and social signaling and like all of the stuff associated with Jeffrey Miller with regards to like sex is all signaling. So I just want to say that Mercier's not saying that everything is like social signaling, but yes, there's a lot of social components to his work, and so I'm just trying to distinguish it from the signaling stuff necessarily.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think I don't know which one of us said signaling first. I think maybe we should annihilate the word signaling from this conversation because I think we might both mean different things by it, and it'll be more helpful if we just use other words. So yeah, his whole thesis is about like reason in the first place is entirely social. If we consider these sort of 4 conditions that are conditions that often have to be met for us to change our mind, 3 of those have to do with your like epistemic environment, let's say, that's going on around you. The first one, source must be trusted. It's like, okay, well, that means trusted according to you right now. So if you're like seriously involved in the anti-vax community, well, what kind of people are you going to trust? You're not going to trust the FDA. You're going to trust Brett Weinstein. And so that's what I mean by social in that sense. Like it's driven by what group you're a part of is maybe another way to say it. Message being plausible given prior beliefs. I mean, again, your prior beliefs are like now a function of the group you're a part of. And so being plausible with your prior beliefs, it's got to align with things you already believe, which is a function of your social group. And then the fact that it must be reinforced socially is, again, just saying the same thing. And so there's sort of like 3 of these mechanisms are very group focused and are like functions of sort of the ecosystem you already inhabit epistemically. And then sort of one of these is like, but the arguments also have to be good.
But even that, no, I don't buy this, because even the arguments have to be good. That too could be cast as a social thing because you're receiving the arguments from another person. And the has to agree with your pre-existing beliefs part could be seen as a non-social thing if you want to forget about where you got your beliefs in the first place. Like, I don't see all of this as being just, it's either trivially all social because this whole thesis is that reason is social, which I think kind of what you're saying. You're not intending to say that, but I think that is what you're saying. Because, yeah, you're getting information from the social milieu in which you exist, but only one of them is specifically talking about like social conformity and stuff. And so in some sense, they're all trivially about social stuff, but I'm more saying only one of them is really talking about like social conformity. Where are you hearing the good arguments from in the first place? Your social group. So in that sense, it's a social thing as well. So we have good arguments. We have pre-existing beliefs. We have trusting the competence of the speaker. Like, again, trusting the competence of the speaker. Sure, you could say that's social, but if the pilot says that we are about to land, I'm trusting his competence, but I don't really think of that as like me trying to trust the social milieu of believing pilots are honest. It just seems like it's not the right lens of analysis there. And so that's why I'm trying to make the case that he is de-emphasizing the social stuff in this subset of the argument much more than Hansen is. He's just, if we can grant that Hansen is largely talking about like social conformity and wanting to maybe signaling isn't
sure, yeah, we can say that.
Yeah. Okay. And then with regards to like being much more aligned with Less Wrong than with Deutsch and Popper, again, it's like a lens thing. So like at the very core, Deutsch and Popper emphasize like arguments and explanations, which I would say are intrinsically intersubjective. They're trying to argue to you and explain to you and receive arguments from you and have stuff explained by you. Whereas beliefs tend to be more individualistic, right? And that's why in his first book, he was very much against the individualist view of reason, which is that you and you alone with your Bayes and your notepad can just reason yourself in isolation to better and better beliefs. And so it's not really clear to me that one of them is more like isolationist, more individualist than the other. And I would say that if all you had to go on was a conversation about an epistemology based on arguments and explanations versus an epistemology based on belief, I would say that the arguments and explanations one tends to just factor in social stuff more than the beliefs one. Even though, yeah, you could zoom out and say, well, where'd you get your beliefs in the first place? You got them from their social group and stuff, but that's like not really the focus of any of the Less Wrong writing, right? How much of that works for you?
Yeah, I think this will be interesting to ask him about, like, sort of where he falls in this camp. Because, yeah, I mean, I no doubt that we just do change our mind when there's like a lot of evidence and good arguments being made. That does happen. That being said, I think the view from social conformity explains more of the world than you're ready to admit. So when the flat earther gets on the plane, he does think the pilot's lying, right? He thinks you're not flying circularly around the globe. You're not taking these spherical geodesics, right? You're like, well, I don't know. I don't know exactly what pilots are doing, presumably, turning around at some point and flying backwards. So that person doesn't trust the pilot. Why did Ben Shapiro come out against terrorists? It's a good question. I think part of it is probably because he's also like awkwardly surrounded by tons of anti-Semitism, being in the MAGA camp right now. And I think that goes part of the way to explaining why he's sort of ready to diverge from Trump on some stuff. Why is like Twitter right now just this absolutely comedic landscape of tons of MAGA people making these crazy justifications about tariffs, all of a sudden turning on a dime and saying, we don't actually need abundance. You don't need the new iPad.
It's good when the stock market goes down.
It's good when the stock market goes down. It's good to live stoically. Like, this is absolute, this is comedic, right? This is crazy. And I think this can be explained by social pressure.
Oh, I don't buy this, man. Like, yeah.
You don't buy this? Oh, really? Okay, interesting. What do you think is going? Do you think they actually just heard good arguments about tariffs and changed their mind, or what?
Well, take the flat earther thing. Like, you're kind of cherry picking the social environment that the flat earther lives in. Like, if you just go by sheer numbers, the flat earther is clearly in a social environment that is pointing him or her towards a round earth theory. Every person he meets is going to say, what the hell are you talking about? But then when you talk about social environment, you're not thinking about like every passenger on the plane, every person in the guy's family. You're thinking about like the narrow group of other flat earthers who the person's been listening to, right? So like, which social group is kind of not something that we can easily define in this way, right? Like, do you think that a flat earther spends more time with people who believe in flat earth or round earth? I would say round earth. I don't know. Presumably they're like, I don't know, they have family members who don't believe in this shit. They have kids. They go to work, assuming that they're not just some like tin pot nutcase. Like, they're probably like roughly normal people with this weird belief, right? And what does Mercier say? Mercier says in the latter half of the book that most people have these weird beliefs, not because of social stuff necessarily, but because they are actually pretty plausible. That's what his claim is that like people believe in anti-vax, not necessarily because it's just the best way for them to fit into their social group, but because it actually passes a lot of the filters that he laid out, right? Yeah. Right. So it's like, it is plausible that like injecting this weird chemical into you is going to cause you harm. Not just
chemical. I mean, you're injecting a pathogen into you. Like, it's extremely counterintuitive that this works. Yeah.
But if it was just social group dynamics, then like,
I'm not saying it's I'm just saying, okay, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. No, sorry. But like, to me, a lot of the major emphasis of Mercier's work is that social dynamics are just one of many things. But I think this is maybe where one of us is getting the interpretation wrong, and so it's great that we can ask him.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah. So let's maybe stop arguing about this, but just to give my concluding thoughts here. Again, I'm not saying that these mechanisms are bad. I totally agree with him that these mechanisms are evolved for very useful purposes. And I just think it's prima facie obvious that most people, for instance, don't know what's going on with climate change, even if they believe in climate change. Why do they believe that climate change is happening? It's because they believe in the scientific institutions that are telling them it's happening and the experts on TV. If they actually had to go up in an argument with someone who had done a bunch of reading and was skeptical of climate change, they would get destroyed. So it is with our favorite interpretation of quantum mechanics. So it is with like most things we believe, because we simply don't have the time to dive in to everything and come up and like argue about everything on a podcast with someone and come up with our own views and fact check everything. So it's to be expected and very reasonable and evolutionary advantageous to do all this sort of like group checking where it's like, you have like certain sources that you trust. You have your favorite sources, right? You have Pinker or Harris or Ridley or someone says something, you buy in because you trust them. And that's it's very understandable. And I'm just saying we all have stuff like this. And I'm saying, this explains most people's beliefs on most subjects. And it's a function of group dynamics and social trust and stuff, much more than it is a story of like human rationality of like drilling down to the facts.
Nice. Yeah, let's I won't get too dug in, but let's definitely I guess the one thing I'll say is like it depends kind of on your level of analysis, because his largest thesis is that reason is a social phenomenon, right? So if you talk about it at that level, then yeah, okay, I agree, it's all social. But that's kind of not at least the level that I'm interested in talking about it. It's more like, of the set of epistemic open vigilance mechanisms, how much of them are specifically about like conformity and group status and signaling your membership in a group, and how much of these mechanisms are not that. And at least to me, that's where we are disagreeing.
Yep.
And maybe that's a nice way to at least put a bow on this particular disagreement.
One thing I also do want to try and remember to ask him is just if this dovetails at all with Taleb's, another character I know you have massive respect for, his thesis about skin in the game, which I actually think is a pretty useful lens to have on human belief. And what I would expect is that we're better at actually changing our mind with respect to good arguments only, regardless of social status and stuff, when we actually bear the consequences of our decisions, and that we're much more susceptible to just like trusting what our group already believes when we don't actually have skin in the game. And this explains a lot of like climate change stuff, for instance, with like as an individual, you're not going to notice, it's not going to affect your life at all. And political beliefs often have this character as well. So anyway, I also want to ask him about that and see if there's any overlap there.
I guess, so annoyingly, I have to end this conversation a bit short because I have to switch on to a father duty. But maybe just the way I want to wind down is not doing the typical summarize thing, which I would love to do, but just saying how much of the book contains stuff that we haven't talked about yet, because this thesis then runs into so many of my own intuitions of like, no, this has got to be wrong. And he goes into these really nice case studies on a number of concrete specific things, which I just encourage the reader to follow up on. He talks about I'm just going to list them now as a means of hopefully getting people to buy his book. He talks about overall the inefficacy of advertisement campaigns, the inefficacy of like propaganda campaigns like North Korea, China, that kind of stuff. The inefficacy of like Nazi propaganda. So the book was written in 2020 after Trump's first election. So he does also talk about Trump. He talks a good amount about like conspiracy theories and flat earthers and cult dynamics and stuff too. And each of them, he makes a really compelling case, but I'll just say, just not to leave the listener at a cliffhanger, the high level thing that all these examples get wrong is that when people believe stupid shit like conspiracy theories or cults or MAGA or something like that, it tends to not be a top-down message that is being pumped into people, but it tends to be a bottom-up public sentiment. And so Trump's demagoguery and like the populist movements and stuff, like this makes perfect sense because he would just spend day after day at campaign rallies. And in that way, he's measuring public sentiment. He doesn't give a shit about anything. He just cares about his own aggrandizement. But he just speaks for 3 hours and sees what gets a reaction. And then the thing that gets a reaction is the thing he's going to say again tomorrow. And in that way, he has his finger on the pulse of what is the public sentiment. And then he just kind of crafts his message around that. So that doesn't fully explain everything, but that, at least to me, was a big aha moment. It's that demagogues and populists and stuff tend to ride bottom-up sentiment. And when there are these really crazy beliefs out there, like flat earthers and vaccines and stuff, it's not because people are gullible. It's because the information is plausible to their prior beliefs. And if your prior beliefs are that, like, can't really trust the government and organic food is better for you, and if the food only has like one ingredient, that's going to be much better than if it has a bunch of stuff you can't pronounce. Like, these are pretty intuitive common beliefs, I think. And it's that bad memes can then hijack these kinds of baseline intuitions, and then populists and stuff can ride up on top of that. But that is not doing his book justice, because he goes into each case and he cites a lot of like great research. And I would just strongly recommend the second half of the book, which we haven't really talked about too much here. So yeah, that would just be my last comment. Any last things on your side?
No, I think that was good. That was a fun intro episode on it. And yeah, I'm excited to have him on.
Yeah, I can't wait. And then we'll have a little 3-episode Mercier series on our YouTube playlist to go 1, 2, 3, which is because I do want to try to spend equal time talking about academics we like and whose work we want to celebrate, as much as we do spending time about academics we dislike and whose work we want to criticize. I think it's too easy for me to fall into the purely critical camp, and I want to try to do 50-50. So Mercier is dope and highly recommended stuff, and can't wait to talk to him in a couple weeks. Yeah.
All right.
Cool. Sayonara.